Viewers, welcome back to this very important podcast on the Indo-Pacific. And I have got with me Aditi Malhotra after such a long time. And I have been quite trying hard to get her on for this conversation. And finally, she has made it. First of all, I'd like to welcome her on the podcast. Welcome, Aditi.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mehraj. It's a pleasure being here.
And this entire podcast will be powered by Study Box Tuition Center, tuitions at your doorstep. Before I begin, I'll just draw a little bit introduction about Aditi. She's a researcher. She's a Canada-based researcher actually on the Indo-Pacific. She has a book or two to her credit on this Indo-Pacific discourse, and one has just recently got published, and the other has been published earlier. She has been working with lots of organizations in her career as a researcher so far, and also with some policy think tanks back in India. So we'll be talking about Indo-Pacific from the Western perspective mainly, and then we'll be touching upon US strategy and US perspective on the Indo-Pacific. Let's make the introduction first because most of the people and the researchers just get bogged down and buttressed by the entire Indo-Pacific terminology and the geographical landscape and the strategic extent of this entire Indo-Pacific discourse. So over to you, Aditi. Just draw us an introductory
Hmm.
remark on this Indo-Pacific. What's it all about?
For sure. So, of course, if you look at the Indo-Pacific, it's more like, a terminology which has come, in play over the last, say, almost 2 decades and perhaps less than that. And it's been, an interesting phenomenon that we see because it kind of started replacing the mental map, if you will, the idea of the Asia Pacific. So now what has happened over these years? If you look at it, the whole idea, the geopolitical construct of the Indo-Pacific is actually a geopolitical area which spans the two regions of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And it actually stretches, again, every country has a nuanced view of how they look at the Indo-Pacific and their specific role within. But if you look at, say, from the American point of view, from them, the idea of the Indo-Pacific actually stretches from, the coast of the US to the west coast of India. Similarly, for India, it's a bit more expansive in that sense, wherein they're looking at the east coast of Africa to Oceania. So, of course, the idea has evolved over time. And what the Indo-Pacific does is kind of acknowledges the rise of Asia and, the developments in the Indian Ocean region, which are now kind of seen as an interconnected region with the Pacific. So it's no longer seen as like a separate theater of operation or separate theater of strategic thought. These are like two seemingly, previously they were considered like separate theaters, but now they're regarded as interconnected. And of course, this, kind of has a lot of sub-regions within, whether it's, the eastern coast of Africa or the Indian Ocean region, the Southeast Asian countries, you have the Pacific Island nations as well, the west coast of US, of course, and Oceania. So there are a lot of sub-regions within this broader region. But what it does is kind of, denotes how Asia has risen. And of course, China being one of the principal actors within, and how the US looks at China in that sense. And it's considered kind of, a threat to the larger American, led idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific.
Quite interesting that is. I mean, cutting across all the jargon that is involved into the literature that's being powered and put in by lots of researchers into that. There is also some ambiguity when we talk about the US Indo-Pacific strategy. Aditi, I just want you to be clear about it. What entire document is all about when we talk about the White House strategy on Indo-Pacific? Can we just delve upon that for a while?
For sure, of course. So if you look at, the US Indo-Pacific strategy, again, it started off early on. It started off during, the Obama era. We noticed how, the whole idea of the pivot to Asia started, and then that, of course, evolved over time. So despite a lot of evolution, there has been a lot of continuity as well. And one of the, broader aspects of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to make sure that they kind of nurture the Indo-Pacific region in a manner there wherein you cannot have one power dominating. And of course, in this case, it is China. So the idea is to not, is to ensure that it is not China which is kind of dominating the region in an undisputed manner. And the idea is to give alternatives to the regional actors in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, there are some very specific aspects of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US. One of it is, of course, the whole idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific, whether it is, the strengthening the resilience of regional countries therein, or the resilience among, between these countries, and how they're talking about, the idea of protecting the seas and, what international waters in that sense, according to the international law. And of course, if you based on who you're talking to, the idea of free and open is always, more nuanced, and there's not one perspective, but this is like an American perspective. And they're also looking at, connecting and deepening alliances, and continuing to deepen their alliances with Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Philippines, Thailand. And at the same time, they're looking to partner with a lot of countries, whether, it's India, Indonesia, Vietnam. And, we've seen the rise of new forums in that sense. We've seen the Quad come up, we've seen AUKUS. And these all things are kind of connected to the idea and the strategy of the Indo-Pacific. Other factors which the Indo-Pacific strategy looks at is, talking about having a secure Indo-Pacific, resilient and prosperous. So there are these different terminologies which come along, but broadly the idea is to make sure that, the region is so strong from within and follows the broader international laws that exist so that China cannot dominate. And of course, if we can, of course, get into detail about this aspect, but one of the driving factors of the US defense policy is the idea of integrated deterrence. And I think if you want, we can, of course, expand on that.
Yeah, sure. We can have some thoughts on that, and we can just exchange them. Lots of things have been happening across the globe, especially given that U.S. Russia Ukraine war that has happened, and still we haven't reached to a point where we can have a consensus. I mean, the countries can have a consensus and agreements, so that to instill peace again into the region. And why I have brought into that European perspective over here is that China is having a closer collaboration with the European Union when it comes to security, when it comes to other cooperation in technology sector and other domains. Is it going to impact the larger Indo-Pacific grouping, or can it cast shadows on the entire Indo-Pacific collaboration, given that the European countries that we talk about, the important countries, I mean the countries that have a significant influence on the global geopolitical chessboard, can this entire European Union and the developments in Europe hamper the Indo-Pacific strategy or Indo-Pacific collaboration?
So that's actually a very interesting question, because there has been constant debate on the fact that, is the US getting, is there diversion of attention towards, the Ukraine-Russia war? Of course, if we look at, since 2014, Russia's first invasion of Crimea and then the reinvasion of Ukraine more recently, that has been a persistent challenge for the US for sure. And even though, there has been a lot of talk about how this is taking the US away from the Indo-Pacific and, its strategy, but to be very frank, on the ground, I do not see that happening. And I'm not saying that, the US is effectively dealing with both these areas, because one of them is more on, the transatlantic aspect and the other is more on the Indo-Pacific. But I think within DC, there is recognition that even though, the current and the more medium term threat, security threat, and, for them, of course, a lot of nuisance that is created in the whole global arena comes from Russia, from, the American point of view. But at the same time, there is this understanding and this, bipartisan realization within the US that China is the long-term threat at the end of the day. And at the same time, China and Russia are not really seen as two separate countries, because even though they are, of course, but they are partners as well, right? They have their partnership, and there is this fear that, Russia, as it's, of course, it's an ongoing war, so it's difficult to say what finally happens, and this is likely to be protracted. But even with this ongoing war, Russia is not likely to come out as a, as a very, effective security actor, because they've lost a lot, and they will be taking a lot of time to rearm themselves if they want to, and strengthen themselves as a country. So they've been worse off at every level. And one of the general fears is, because of this and growing Russia-China cooperation and coordination, Russia is likely to be like a junior partner within the Russia-China partnership. And this, of course, has broader implications, whether it's strategically or security-wise, for the US. So even though they are two different countries, their partnership has serious implications. And that is where the idea of what's happening in Europe and the Indo-Pacific kind of, even though they're distinct and, separate theaters, they will still have common implications for the US. And I think there is deep realization. But to, just put it in a very brief manner, I personally do not think it has taken away, US's priority, despite, it actually focusing on, the Russia aspect as of now.
And when we can just get over with certain other things that are involved into the conversation expectedly, but we're talking about something related to deterrence. Just elaborate that thing.
So the idea of integrated deterrence, of course, comes from the US, and the idea is to combine all the instruments of national power and integrate them, whether it's conventional forces, whether it's nuclear, cyber, space, information. So all these separate domains, the idea is to look at them in an integrated manner and have all these instruments come together, not just from the US, but across partners and across allies, so that it does not come across as if there is something which, goes from the DC perspective, if something goes amiss in the Indo-Pacific region, you want rapid responses and strong defense presence. And this may not always mean the US being directly there. So they're talking about using all instruments and having, and utilizing their partnerships and alliances within this region. So there is rapid response. So in short, the idea is to integrate a lot of different domains within the US and all across the partners and allies, and actually use this, to deter China from actually becoming more and more assertive and laying its claim on a lot of, controversial aspects, such as, the 9-dash lines.
And when we talk about now that the borderline is that the Asia Pacific larger theater that's there, and the Indo-Pacific strategy stems from that, and given that the domination that China executes and has an influence on the global geopolitics and the countries around, uh, we have just understood that thing. Now, say there are researchers who will argue that maybe this entire Indo-Pacific strategy powered by US, and then the collaboration that stems out of this Indo-Pacific networking, there are no specifics. I mean, this entire strategy lacks that specific thing and the specifics, and it has just the amount of ambiguity left within the policy and within it, that most of the countries and most of the people won't actually comprehend to what the realities are there, and what actually the documents are actually talking about. Why are these specifics still lacking, given that the COVID pandemic times that we live in, and the global geopolitical turbulence that we are actually part of? I mean, why does that specific thing come from?
So, Indo-Pacific, as I said, is a very recent geopolitical construct. And, these developments over the last 2 decades have kind of, assimilated together and brought up this concept. And it's evolving, not just in terms of concept, but in terms of the strategy as well. It's work in progress for a lot of countries, because if we actually look at it, it's not that there's just one perspective on what the Indo-Pacific is and what are the countries that come within the Indo-Pacific. every country has a different view, whether it's the US, of course, even US allies sometimes may not always agree with the US on how they look at the Indo-Pacific. India, for that matter, even though India started embracing, the idea of Indo-Pacific from 2012 onwards, but we've always seen that, how India has looked at the region and how India has dealt with the region is much more different as opposed to, the US for that matter. So I think there are a lot of countries with different perspectives and with some nuances on how they want to deal with it. So of course, it's impossible to be like, oh, there's complete congruence on everyone, how everyone looks at it. So there's this concept known as, convergence, divergence dynamics. And what this means is that when the US is dealing with the Indo-Pacific countries as such, there are areas of convergences and shared interest, but there are also areas of divergences. And those divergences, continue to stay. They are persistent. So what is happening is that in areas where there are shared interests, there is growing cooperation on those aspects. And as those cooperations become stronger and stronger, the specifics of a lot of aspects become clearer. So even if we look at the Indo-Pacific in terms of the economic aspect, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US has largely been driven by security considerations. But more recently, we've seen how the US realizes that it needs to, be there present in the region, even as an economic actor, which is why we've seen the US come up with some of these frameworks, that are looking at the economic aspect. So because of these things, I think there's a lot of work in progress, and those specifics on every aspect, like on some aspects, of course, there are a lot of specifications, but then there's so much happening already, and it's a growing and a work in progress. So this is bound, the specifics will keep changing and will keep evolving with time.
And when we talk about this influence that it has on the Chinese domination and the primary factor that moved US and the other allies against Chinese belligerence and expansionism, and its techniques and tools with which it's conducting itself over the time, and what's the influence that China has faced because of this entire collaboration? Are there any significant inroads that the entire Indo-Pacific strategy has been able to make when it comes to the influence by the China?
So, again, the idea is like it's very difficult to say tangibly if there's been an influence or if China has stopped doing things that it has been doing, which have caused concerns in various regions. I would not say that, oh, everything's changed. Of course, China, has been an assertive actor. We've seen that, after the 2008 financial crisis, that China has been assertive, not just in terms of its maritime claims, but also in terms of its, land claims. Whether we look at the India-China standoff, along the line of actual control, or we look at how China has been claiming a lot of, maritime areas, which actually, come under what they call as the 9-dash lines. So these are like claims which they say are historical, and they've been assertively, trying their best to ensure that other smaller regional actors are unable to operate in these regions or in these maritime spaces. And those are some things which the US has been trying to deter. But one of the biggest challenges, even though they do like phone ops and they are trying to use a lot of, they're trying to build capacity for a lot of regional actors so that they can deal with China's assertiveness at their level as well. But even then, what we've noticed is how China is not always, just tackling or dealing with these maritime problems on traditional security, spectrums. If you look at it, there's been a lot of, what is called as gray zone tactics from Chinese side, wherein they're not using conventional, military or security forces, but what they're doing are using these paramilitary, or they're using, ships, seemingly civilian ships, and using them to kind of, make their way and claim these maritime areas. So there is a lot of, the whole salami slicing tactic or technique, as a lot of people call it. So there is a lot happening. And I would not say that China is, that the US has been successful, China has been deterred. No, of course, this is something which is ongoing. And it's only with time and hindsight that one would realize. Having said that, I think one of the dangers that the US should avoid and should not fall into the trap is to fall into the binaries days of the Cold War style mentality of either you're with the US or you're with China. I think this is something, there is greater cognizance within DC that this is something they have to avoid, but then this has to be something for sure, because otherwise regional actors, when they're pushed to choose between one side, it will create more problems for the US.
There must be realization at the greater level when we talk about the public opinion of US, that at least give, if in order to stop and escape from the Cold War mentality, you have to give the countries the strategic autonomic and the zone and the spheres they actually want themselves to be in. Given that the geopolitical divergences and the convergences at the rate and at the scale they are, I mean, there is a realization, and I hope that most of the policymakers just have that understanding. And when we talk about the nine dash line and the entire South China Sea dispute, what are the developments over there? If we can talk about it, because it's part of the larger Indo-Pacific.
I think one of the biggest challenges when we talk about the South China Sea for a lot of countries has been how China has been building these, these islands, and they've not just been using them for civilian purposes. Of course, they claim that these have been for civilian purposes, but what we've seen is how they've been developing, a lot of security and defense-related infrastructure in these islands, and they're using these islands to, expand their claims and concretize, if you can call it that, trying to concretize their claims over these regions. And the gray zone tactics, as I said, like, of course, one thing is how the how the traditional Chinese military looks at it, but the other thing is how they're actually implementing these strategies, wherein they're using a mix of civilian assets and military assets. And so I think these are the bigger challenges. And over the recent years, these developments have caused concerns, not just for the US, but of course, for regional actors and other claimants in the region. And I think this remains a persistent challenge, because for anyone dealing with it, if you kind of cross that threshold of, and go into a more military domain to deal with it, then you're kind of escalating it. And what China is doing, it's trying to keep it under the threshold of conventional defense and conventional, maritime domain. So I think this has been a challenge. This will remain a challenge. And I think in the recent times, these are the developments that have caused concern.
And when we talk about the times that we are in, geopolitical turbulences that we are part of, US is not actually having the luxury to keep the other countries and the West and the partners from the West afloat or acclimatized with its synergy and the strategy of Indo-Pacific. What do you talk about that? I mean, how do you take it as a researcher?
Mhm. No, you're very, very, very right when you say that the US does not have the capacity, that it did previously. So if you look at how the US has been over recent decades, during the Cold War, it was a bipolar world. And after 89, 1990, we've seen that there was this unipolar moment wherein the US was the undisputed actor at the global arena, despite having, countries question and, challenge this unipolar order. But despite that, US was strong, and it was able to kind of build on what it wanted to do in the region, and its vision was largely because it had deep pockets, and because all the strategy that it followed was what a lot of people call as the rich person strategy, because they had the money to implement a lot of things. So even if they did not have consensus among the different actors, US could do a lot of things unilaterally. But what has happened in the recent times, with the economic center of gravity, is shifting towards Asia. And with this shift, what has happened is that US has weakened as an economic actor, and the international liberal economic order has also, gotten weaker. As a result of that, where US stands today is not where US was a few decades before. As a result, what it's been doing is, with this realization, it's been reaching out to allies and partners saying that we'll help build capacity wherein we can. We'll help you become stronger and resilient actors, so that all the responsibilities do not squaringly rely on the US as such. And all its resources are not consumed unilaterally, in that sense, because they want a lot of other countries, whether it's Europe, whether it's Asian countries, they want to share the security burden which it was taking on its own for so many decades. So I think that has been a transition, and that is something which very clearly comes across, in the US Indo-Pacific strategy, that they are relying heavily on the allies and the partners for doing a lot of it as well.
I mean, to the last part of this conversation, I'd like you to talk about the India's being India being partner to this Indo-Pacific strategy. There is a realization, and that's how India has been accommodated in the entire Indo-Pacific strategy by the US and its other allies in the region. Why do you see India as a partner to the Indo-Pacific strategy? How has it been?
So, India's perception and vision of the Indo Pacific strategy has, of course, evolved over the years. We've seen, it's very interesting. A lot of people do not realize that the whole idea of the Indo Pacific was originally not really pitched by the US. The idea actually came from Japan. So, it was, the former Japanese Prime Minister Abe who actually instilled this whole idea. And what he'd done, if you remember, during 2007, if I'm not wrong, he actually presented, he gave a talk at the Indian Parliament where he talked about the confluence of two seas. And that is exactly the concept which eventually transitioned into the Indo-Pacific. So again, it's not an American construct as such. Of course, the US, embraced it, but the original idea kind of came from Japan. And over the years, like as I said, that every country has a different way of looking at the Indo-Pacific. So does India. India has a very nuanced perspective on how the Indo-Pacific is, what it is, and where India's role lies within this broader construct. And what India does is it looks at itself within the broader Indo-Pacific. It looks at itself as an important stakeholder in the safety, security, and prosperity of the region. But within the Indo-Pacific, India's larger and primary areas of interest lie in the northern Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean at large. And in this region, India has been trying to act like a provider of net security. Of course, within India, there is constant debate on if India should get into this role or not. But having said that, India remains a dominant maritime actor in the Indian Ocean region. And within the broader Indo-Pacific, India has been trying to carve a niche for itself. But at the same time, it wants to avoid the whole trap of being regarded as a balancer to China in the region. What India wants to do is kind of have its own identity as an important stakeholder and as an important security actor, but does not want to get into again the binaries of balancing for the US, vis-a-vis China. It wants to have its own identity, and I think that is something that we have seen in the recent years.